The history of finance. In terms of the history of finance, let's focus on the uh, 20th century. Let me share a file. We see in the 20th century, economics provides the broad basis upon which a lot of economic decisions are going to be made. Are you in a growth economy? Is the economy shrinking? Are wages going up or down? These are some of the factors that come into play, economic factors that come into play as decisions are going to be made by financial managers. Accounting is going to provide us financial information. We're going to get that through the basic financial statements, income statements, balance sheets, statements of owner's equity, as well as the statement of cash flow. The linkage is finance, as economic theory and accounting numbers come together. I did previously share with you this image of the Ohio River. We have the Allegheny River and the Monongahela River coming together to form finance. You can't have coming together to form the Ohio River. You can't have finance unless it's preceded by the use of accounting and accounting tools and reports married up with economic information. In terms of the 20th century, we start focusing on some really very significant events as some of the great capitalists of really United States industry take action based on what they feel are favorable economics and opportunities. The Vanderbilts assemble the railroads, which begin to give transportation continuity coast to coast. Carnegie forms U.S. Steel through headquartered in Pittsburgh, and through the cumulative effect of many mergers and acquisitions, U.S. Steel is assembled. Much like the Rockefellers in oil and gas, assembling what became Exxon and is now ExxonMobil through many mergers and acquisitions and consolidations. And finally, J.P. Morgan assembled a great house of banking used to finance many businesses. So these were some of the very large developments in the early part of the century. Following the Great Depression, we have the period of the 1930s, where the focus of finance turns to preserving capital. That makes sense. The Great Depression brought upon great capital losses, a lot of pain and anguish and suffering, and capital preservation, or how to keep your capital in place and not have it deteriorate, becomes a focus. Similarly, liquidity becomes extremely important. Liquidity being your ability to pay bills and have sufficient cash. Many companies needed to be reorganized. Lots of troubled corporations coming out of the Great Depression, and the bankruptcy process became formalized and extremely important in the aftermath of the Great Depression. In the 1950s, we're in post-World War II. We've built lots of great industrial strength, sort of an industrial infrastructure, in part through the early part of the century, as well as World War II, where a great economic engine or industrial engine was assembled in the United States. And now, as a little bit of wealth begins to accumulate in the 1950s, financial managers look towards taking their capital or money and using this to invest in plants and equipment, which is going to bring upon growth. The ability to produce and expand gross domestic product, to provide additional housing to many who had previously not had their own housing in this country. This generates cash, makes the management of cash as well as inventories more important, and we begin to see a focus on capital structure theory. That is, as we have a publicly traded company, and we can either choose to sell stock to capitalize our company, or we can sell bonds to capitalize our company, or use retained earnings to capitalize our company. We get a formalization of this thing called capital structure theory, where we look at all those different components. Finally, dividends become important as companies are more successful. They generate sufficient cash so that after they've feel that the capital structure for the company is sufficient, you have plenty of hard assets, sufficient cash on hand, companies are perhaps able to share with shareholders a dividend based on the approval of the board of directors. Today we have a lot of focus on risk and return. What is the maximum return you might expect given a level of risk? A lot of this comes out of the pain in which the country went through and the economy went through in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. Very, very significant levels of unemployment were suffered. Many businesses went bankrupt, and a greater focus on maximizing return for a given level of risk becomes the emphasis. The Great Recession came about in part by there being lots of excess risk in lending and loans that went bad, threatening the banking industry. As a result, in the aftermath of that Great Recession, the focus in finance becomes risk and return. Also, inflation and deflation, of which we had significant runs of inflation and deflation throughout this time period, become quite important and factor into capital budgeting decisions and the allocation of resources. So that's a brief focus on the history of finance.